LaCroix is marketed as a Parisian lifestyle accessory, but its core business model is Midwest manufacturing efficiency. Founded in 1981 in LaCroix's, Wisconsin, the brand spent 30 years as a forgotten generic beverage for soccer moms before accidentally becoming the status symbol of the Instagram generation. By selling water with a hint of flavor in cans that looked like 1980s neon art, it convinced millennials to abandon Diet Coke. But behind the pastel aesthetic lies a bizarre corporate structure run by a reclusive billionaire who writes poetry to his shareholders, and a legal scandal involving cockroach insecticide that threatened to pop the bubble forever. From a Midwest brewery to a fake French identity, the American beverage market in 1981 offered consumers exactly two choices. You could buy soda, Coke, Pepsi, or 7-Up, which was cheap, sugary, and available on every corner. Or, if you wanted to signal sophistication, you bought Perrier. Perrier sat alone at the top of the pyramid. Imported from France in heavy green glass bottles, it was the beverage of choice for Wall Street bankers and yuppies. It represented status. The middle ground, an affordable sparkling water for the working class, simply did not exist. That changed in LaCroix's, Wisconsin. The G. Heilemann Brewing Company was about as far from a Parisian cafe as you could get. Known for brewing old style, the cheap lager beloved by Chicago Cubs fans, Heilemann was a blue-collar operation. But the executives saw the sales figures coming out of France. Perrier was making a fortune selling carbonated water, and Heilemann already had the water source and the canning lines. They just needed a brand. They wanted a name that sounded premium and European, something that could sit next to Perrier without looking out of place. But they didn't hire a branding agency. They just looked at a local map. The brewery was located in the city of LaCroix's, near the St. Croix River. They combined the two names, LaCroix. It was a pragmatic Midwestern decision that inadvertently birthed a pseudo-French identity. To the ear, it sounded imported and expensive. In reality, it was local water brewed in a beer vat. The product itself was surprisingly ahead of its time. While the diet sodas of the 1980s were loaded with artificial sweeteners like saccharin, leaving a harsh chemical aftertaste, LaCroix was clean. It contained nothing but water and carbonation. No sugar, no sodium, no calories. However, the original packaging failed to match the purity of the liquid. The 1980s can lack the famous pastel splash we see today. Instead, it featured a generic blue and white design that looked like a store-brand product found in a hospital vending machine. It had zero cool factor. For its first decade, LaCroix remained a regional sleeper. It served as a filler brand, popular in the Midwest because of its low price point. It became the default drink for suburban mothers trying to wean themselves off Diet Pepsi but missing the carbonation. It generated a few $1 million a year, a steady, boring commodity business. Throughout the 1990s, consumer tastes began to evolve. The market started demanding flavor. Brands like Snapple and Arizona Iced Tea exploded onto the scene. LaCroix responded by slowly introducing hints of lemon, lime, and berry. Crucially, they stuck to a pure philosophy. They used natural essence oils, extracts derived from heating fruit skins, rather than sugary syrups. This gave the water a very subtle flavor, a whisper of fruit, rather than a punch. At the time, many consumers found this weakness frustrating, asking, "Where's the flavor?" 20 years later, that subtlety would become the brand's greatest asset. By the early 2000s, the G. Heilemann Brewing Company was being broken up and sold off. LaCroix became an orphan brand, a small regional asset floating in a sea of corporate restructuring. It needed a new owner. It needed someone who saw that this quiet Midwestern water can was actually a sleeping giant. And down in Florida, A man named Nick Caparella was watching. In the world of American business, Nick Caparella is an enigma. A former contractor who made his fortune laying gas pipelines, he pivoted into the beverage industry with a style that can only be described as eccentric. Based in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, he built National Beverage Corp. Into a quiet empire by acquiring regional sodas that the big giants ignored, brands like Shasta and Faygo. Caparella ran his public company like a private fiefdom. He famously avoided Wall Street analysts, refused to do earnings calls, and wrote press releases that read more like stream of consciousness poetry than financial reports. He was known for signing off with phrases like Team National and patriotism. In 2002, Caparella saw an opportunity in the Midwest. The G. Heilemann Brewing Company was dissolving, and its non-alcoholic assets were up for grabs. While most buyers were interested in the beer brands, Caparella zeroed in on the water. He bought LaCroix for a sum estimated to be around $50 million. At the time, it seemed like a modest addition to a portfolio full of discount sodas. LaCroix was generating steady cash flow in Wisconsin and Illinois, but it had zero national presence. Under Caparella's ownership, the strategy for LaCroix shifted. National Beverage Corp specialized in low-cost manufacturing and distribution. They knew how to make cans cheaply and get them onto shelves efficiently. Caparella didn't try to reinvent the product immediately. He kept the natural essence formula. He kept the no sugar promise. But he began to expand the distribution footprint. He used his existing network of Shasta trucks to push LaCroix out of the Midwest and into the coastal markets. However, the brand faced an identity crisis. In 2002, it still looked like a relic of the 1980s. The blue and white can was dated. It blended into the background. To compete on a national stage against giants like Perrier and the rising tide of bottled waters like Dasani and Aquafina, LaCroix needed a facelift. Caparella's team realized that the natural aspect was their strongest selling point, but the packaging looked industrial. They needed something that signaled refreshment, flavor, and vibrancy without screaming soda. This realization set the stage for one of the most fortuitous design decisions in marketing history. They didn't hire a Madison Avenue agency. They didn't spend millions on focus groups. They simply tried to make the can look different. And in doing so, they accidentally created a piece of pop art. After the acquisition in 2002, LaCroix did not immediately become a superstar. In fact, inside the national beverage empire, it was treated like a stepchild. Nick Caparella's crown jewel was Shasta, a value-priced soda brand that competed with Coke and Pepsi on price, not prestige. Shasta was the volume driver. It kept the factories running and the lights on. LaCroix, by comparison, was a niche product. It was water without the fun. For nearly a decade, National Beverage employed a strategy of benign neglect. They didn't kill the brand, but they didn't really feed it either. There were no TV commercials. There were no celebrity endorsements. There were no billboards in Times Square. Instead, they used LaCroix as a strategic pawn in the portfolio strategy. When National Beverage sales reps negotiated with grocery chains like Kroger or Publix, they used Shasta as the leverage. They would say, if you buy 100 cases of Shasta Cola, we will throw in 10 cases of LaCroix for free. This strategy, known as bundle pricing, had an unintended but brilliant side effect. It forced LaCroix onto shelves in markets where it had no business being. It pushed the cans out of the Midwest and into the B-list grocery stores of the South and the West Coast. It was placed on the bottom shelf, usually gathering dust, but it was there. During these quiet years, a subtle shift was happening in the American diet. The soda fatigue was setting in. Obesity rates were climbing. Parents were looking for something, anything, that their kids would drink that wasn't full of high fructose corn syrup. LaCroix, sitting quietly on the bottom shelf, became the safe choice. It wasn't cool yet. In 2005, drinking LaCroix meant you were probably a mom in a minivan in suburban Minnesota. It was the beverage of book clubs and PTA meetings. But this unpretentious, uncool reputation protected it. It felt honest. It felt safe. Financially, the brand was growing at a slow, steady burn, about 5 to 10% a year. By 2005, revenue hit the $100 million mark. In the world of beverage giants, this was a rounding error. But to Nick Caparella, it was pure profit. Because he refused to spend capital on advertising, margins were healthy. This wasn't a brilliant psychological strategy yet. It was simply fiscal discipline. Caparella ran a tight ship. He didn't believe in billboards. He believed in the bottom line. He was content to let the cans sit quietly on the shelf, gathering steady returns while his competitors burned cash on Super Bowl ads. But before the hipsters could discover it, the can had to change. The product inside was perfect for the future, but the package was stuck in the past. Nick Caparella knew that if he wanted to move LaCroix from the bottom shelf to the eye-level shelf, he needed to stop looking like a generic commodity. He needed art, and he was about to approve a design that would unwittingly revolutionize the visual language of the grocery store forever. The ugly neon can that broke all design rules. When National Beverage Corporation acquired LaCroix in 2002, the immediate feedback from the field was brutal. The water tasted fine, but the can was invisible. It looked like a generic pharmaceutical product. White, blue, clinical. It screamed diet food for old people. Nick Caparella, the eccentric CEO, didn't want clinical. He wanted energy. He wanted movement. He tasked his internal design team, not a fancy agency, but the same people who designed Shasta Cola cans, to create something new. The brief was vague. Make it look like flavor. The result was a design that violated every rule of 21st century branding. In the early 2000s, the trend in design was minimalism. Apple was teaching the world that less is more. Brands were stripping away clutter, using clean sans serif fonts and plenty of white space. LaCroix went the opposite direction. They embraced maximalism. The new can design featured a chaotic swirl of neon brushstrokes. It looked like a finger painting done by a hyperactive child. The colors clashed. For the pamplemousse flavor, they paired a sunset coral pink with a radioactive lime green on a silver background. It was loud. It was tacky. It looked like a windbreaker from 1991. When the design was presented, traditional marketers were horrified. They argued it looked cheap. They said it would confuse the consumer, but Caparella approved it. Why? Because of the billboarding effect. He understood the physics of the grocery aisle. When you stack 12 cans of LaCroix next to each other, the swirling lines connect. They create a continuous undulating wave of color that stretches for 3 feet. In a sea of boring blue water bottles and aggressive masculine soda cans, the LaCroix shelf looked like a piece of pop art. It vibrated. It grabbed the eye from the end of the aisle. The design did something else too. It communicated flavor without using pictures of fruit. Most brands put a photo of a hyper-realistic lemon on the can to say lemon. LaCroix used a swirling yellow brushstroke. It was abstract. It forced the brain to fill in the gap. It suggested an essence rather than a syrup. It subconsciously told the consumer, this isn't juice, it's a vibe. For a decade, this chaotic design sat unnoticed on the bottom shelves. However, as the culture shifted toward irony and nostalgia, This accidental aesthetic transformed from a corporate mistake into the brand's most potent weapon. They hadn't designed a can for the future. They had designed a can that was so uncool, it eventually circled back to being the coolest thing in the room. Long before LaCroix became an accessory for Instagram models in Los Angeles, it found an unlikely home in the open-plan offices of San Francisco. By 2008, the culture of Silicon Valley was shifting. The stereotype of the computer programmer surviving on pizza and Mountain Dew was dying. The new tech worker was different. They were optimization obsessed. They wore Allbirds. They practiced intermittent fasting. They wanted caffeine and hydration, but they didn't want the sugar crash of a Coke or the chemical payload of a Red Bull. Tech companies were in an arms race for talent. To attract engineers, they offered perks. And the most visible perk was the free snack kitchen. Office managers at startups like Facebook, Twitter, and Square were tasked with stocking the fridge. They needed something that looked premium, but was actually cheap. Bottled water was boring. Kombucha was too expensive. LaCroix was the perfect solution. It cost about 25 cents a can. It had 0 calories, so it fit every diet. And because of the loud, colorful packaging, a fridge full of LaCroix looked generous. It looked like a party. LaCroix became the default office water. In the coding bullpens of Palo Alto, a subtle cult began to form. Engineers would stack their empty cans into pyramids on their desks, a trophy wall of hydration. They started debating flavors. Pamplemousse became the gold standard, the reserve currency of the startup fridge. Coconut was polarizing. You either loved it or thought it tasted like sunscreen. This was organic word-of-mouth marketing at its finest. These tech workers were early adopters. When they flew home to New York or Austin for the holidays, they asked their local grocery stores for LaCroix. They spread the gospel. The brand noticed this, but they didn't interfere. National Beverage Corp didn't send sales reps to Google HQ. They didn't sponsor hackathons. They just let the product sit there, allowing the consumers to claim ownership of it. By 2012, LaCroix had silently integrated itself into the daily routine of the American creative class. It was no longer just a beverage, it was a workflow tool. You cracked a can when you started a sprint. You cracked a can when you pushed code. The Silicon Valley sleeper phase proved something critical. LaCroix didn't need to advertise to be cool. It just needed to be available where smart, influential people were thirsty. But to break out of the Silicon Valley bubble and into the mainstream, LaCroix needed to solve a bigger problem. It needed to convince the rest of America to choose a generic-looking can over the heavyweights. Here, the brand's lack of budget inadvertently transformed into its greatest psychological weapon. In an era where consumers were bombarded by Coca-Cola's billion-dollar campaigns, telling them how to feel, LaCroix's silence felt radical. This birthed the era of anti-marketing. Because National Beverage didn't pay celebrities to hold the can, the brand felt uncorrupted. When a millennial saw LaCroix, they didn't see a corporate shill, they saw a discovery. The absence of traditional advertising created a vacuum that consumers rushed to fill with their own meaning. It wasn't just cheap water. It was an act of rebellion against the hard sell. National Beverage fueled this fire with a strategy called giveaway marketing. Instead of buying ads, they simply gave the product away. They sent pallets to music festivals, but not the main stage. They sent them to the backstage artist lounges. They sent crates to small design agencies. They targeted micro-influencers before the term even existed. People with 2,000 followers, not 2 million. They knew that if a cool girl in Brooklyn posted a picture of a pamplemousse can because she genuinely liked the color, it was worth more than $1 million of TV time. It was authentic. This strategy turned the consumers into the marketing department. Fans started dressing up as LaCroix cans for Halloween. They knitted LaCroix sweaters. They baked LaCroix cakes. The brand encouraged this by engaging with almost everyone on social media. If you tagged LaCroix in a photo, they would comment. They would repost. They made the consumer the hero. It was a brilliant inversion of power. Big Soda shouted at you. LaCroix listened to you. By 2013, the fuse was lit. The product was in the right hands. The design was iconic. The price was cheap. But to go from a cult hit to a national obsession, LaCroix needed one final push. It needed a common enemy. It needed the world to turn against its rivals. And in 2014, the war on sugar finally reached its boiling point. By 2014, the American relationship with soda had reached a breaking point. For decades, diet soda had been the solution to the obesity epidemic. If you wanted to be healthy, you drank Diet Coke. It had 0 calories. It was safe. But in 2014, the narrative flipped. Scientific studies began to emerge questioning the safety of artificial sweeteners like aspartame. Consumers started to suspect that the chemicals used to trick their brains into tasting sugar were actually making them crave more sugar. This triggered the Great Sugar Revolt. Sales of carbonated soft drinks began a historic decline. People were fleeing the soda aisle, but they had a problem. Water is boring. The human palate, addicted to the intense sensory stimulation of high fructose corn syrup, found plain tap water depressing. Into this vacuum stepped a new wave of lifestyle diets. The most influential among them was Whole30. Whole30 wasn't just a diet, it was a boot camp. It required participants to eliminate sugar, alcohol, grains, legumes, soy, and dairy for 30 days. It was brutal. For millions of Americans attempting the challenge, their entire culinary world turned beige. They couldn't have wine, they couldn't have beer, they couldn't have Coke, but they could have LaCroix. Because LaCroix contained no sweeteners, natural or artificial, it was deemed Whole30 compliant. It became the only legal vice. This endorsement wasn't official. LaCroix didn't pay the founders of Whole30. It happened organically in the forums and Facebook groups. Desperate dieters shared tips on how to survive the 30 days, and the number one tip was always stock up on LaCroix. LaCroix became an emotional crutch. It replaced the evening glass of wine for the stressed mother. It replaced the afternoon Diet Coke for the office worker. It provided the fizz and the crack of the can that signaled a break, a reward, a moment of pleasure in a life of restriction. This phenomenon fundamentally changed the brand's demographic. It moved LaCroix out of the discount bin and into the wellness basket. It associated the brand with self-improvement, discipline, and health. Suddenly, buying a case of pamplemousse wasn't just grocery shopping. It was a statement that you were cleaning up your act. The sales figures in late 2014 began to show the hockey stick curve. National Beverage Corp watched as volume ticked up, not just in the Midwest, but in Los Angeles, New York, and Austin. The sleeper hit of Silicon Valley and the diet hack of the Whole30 crowd were merging into a single massive wave. The kindling was dry. The fuel was poured. All it needed was a spark to ignite the biggest cultural fire in beverage history. That spark would come from a platform that barely existed 5 years prior, a photo-sharing app that would turn this ugly, colorful can into a global superstar. The age of the Instagram cult was about to begin. The Instagram cult. By 2015, the visual landscape of social media was dominated by curated perfection, minimalist backgrounds, succulence, and muted tones. Into this beige ecosystem, the LaCroix can arrive like a graffiti bomb. the very aesthetics that traditional marketers had mocked. The chaotic neon swirls, the clash of 1980s pink and green, suddenly found a new purpose. It wasn't just packaging, it was camp. For a generation obsessed with irony, the can's aggressive tackiness was its primary selling point. It signaled that you were in on the joke. Influencers began to realize that a can of LaCroix was the perfect prop. It wasn't just a drink, it was a pop of color. It signaled that you were healthy, but you weren't boring. The brand exploded on the platform. But it wasn't because LaCroix was paying influencers. They weren't. Unlike Bang Energy, which hired an army of models, LaCroix relied on user-generated content. Real people, graphic designers in Brooklyn, fashion bloggers in Los Angeles, cool moms in Austin, started tagging the brand voluntarily. They built pyramids of cans. They matched their nail polish to the flavors. They treated the 12-pack box like a designer handbag. National Beverages marketing team, small but nimble, leaned into this. Instead of creating corporate ads, they simply reposted the best photos from their fans. They turned their Instagram feed into a gallery of their consumers' creativity. This validated the fans. It made them feel seen by the brand. This strategy created a powerful feedback loop. The more people posted about LaCroix, the cooler it became. The cooler it became, the more people bought it just to post about it. It also gave birth to a new archetype, the LaCroix bois chaque girl. This wasn't just someone who drank water, it was an identity. It signaled membership to a specific cultural tribe, urban, creative, and performatively ironic. The internet didn't just discuss the flavor, it mythologized it. Social media feeds were flooded with hyperbolic declarations where users claimed the water had essentially replaced their actual blood. It was a strange digital form of devotion. The brand had achieved the holy grail of modern marketing. It had become a personality trait. Meanwhile, in Fort Lauderdale, Nick Caparella was watching this cultural explosion from a distance. Crucially, he didn't try to join the party. A standard CEO might have tried to fellow kids the situation by hiring a cool social media agency to capitalize on the trend. Caparella did the opposite. He remained in his bunker, continuing to write his bizarre stream of consciousness corporate memos that had absolutely nothing to do with the cool image on Instagram. This disconnection was key. The 80-year-old CEO and the 25-year-old hipster were living in parallel universes, united only by the can. The hipsters thought the brand was ironic. Caparella thought it was patriotic. But beneath the pretty pictures lay a powerful economic reality. LaCroix was cheap. A 12-pack cost $4.99. For the cash-strapped millennial generation, burdened by student debt but desperate for luxury, LaCroix was an affordable luxury. It was a way to participate in a high-status trend for less than the price of a latte. As 2015 drew to a close, the buzz was deafening, but the craze was about to get a name. One specific flavor was rising above the rest, becoming the shibboleth of the movement. A flavor with a name so pretentious, yet so silly, that it became a meme in its own right. Every great movement needs a flag. For the LaCroix revolution, that flag was the pamplemousse can. In a lineup of flavors that included lemon, lime, and berry, the existence of pamplemousse was a strange anomaly. It is simply the French word for grapefruit. There was no citron can, there was no bay can, just pamplemousse. This linguistic inconsistency was accidental, a holdover from the brand's original attempt to sound fancy in the 1980s. But in 2016, it became the brand's greatest asset. It became a meme. The internet fell in love with the word. It was fun to say. It was fun to mispronounce. It sounded pretentious and silly at the same time. Twitter exploded with jokes about it. I don't speak French, I speak pamplemousse. It became a shibboleth, a password used to identify members of a group. If you walked into a party and asked for grapefruit, you were an outsider. If you asked for pamp, you were part of the tribe. But beyond the name, there was the flavor itself. LaCroix's flavor profile is notoriously subtle. It doesn't taste like juice. It tastes like the memory of juice. In 2016, a viral tweet perfectly captured this sensory experience. LaCroix tastes like a strawberry was sitting next to a can of water for a short period of time. Another described it as drinking sparkling water while someone screams the name of a fruit from the other room. For any other beverage company, this would be an insult. Watery is usually a criticism. But for LaCroix, it was a badge of honor. The weakness of the flavor was actually its strength. Because it was so subtle, it wasn't cloying. You could drink 6 of them in a day. It didn't coat your teeth with sugar. It was sessionable. The pamplemousse flavor, in particular, hit the perfect note. It had just enough bitterness to feel adult and just enough citrus zest to feel refreshing. It became the default mixer for cocktails. Bartenders in hip speakeasies started using it. It appeared on menus as a named ingredient. This cultural obsession translated into sales figures that were almost embarrassing for the competition. While giants like Perrier and San Pellegrino were spending millions on sleek advertising campaigns featuring models in Italy, LaCroix was winning simply by having a funny name on a pink can. By the summer of 2016, LaCroix controlled nearly 30% of the flavored sparkling water market in the U.S. It was a monopoly of cool. And in Florida, Nick Caparella, the man who had bought the brand for a pittance, was watching his net worth climb into the stratosphere. He was about to become the unlikeliest billionaire in America. While the teenagers were posting selfies on Instagram, a very different demographic was watching LaCroix with equal intensity, the day traders. By 2016, National Beverage Corp had become one of the hottest stocks on the NASDAQ. The financial fundamentals were staggering. Because the company spent almost $0 on traditional advertising, and because the product was essentially water put into aluminum cans, the profit margins were enormous. It was a cash printing machine. Between 2015 and 2017, the stock price of Fizz didn't just climb, it went vertical. It tripled in value. The market cap of the company soared past $5 billion. For Nick Caparella, the man who had bought the brand for peanuts in 2002, this was the ultimate vindication. He wasn't just a rich guy anymore, he was a billionaire. But he wasn't a typical billionaire CEO. He didn't do CNBC interviews. He didn't wear suits. He ran the company from Fort Lauderdale with a style that baffled Wall Street. Caparella was famous for writing his own press releases. They were not standard corporate disclosures. They were bizarre stream of consciousness manifestos, often typed in Comic Sans or bold italics. In one earnings report, he wrote, "We are not just a company. We are a feeling. We are the fizz in the veins of America." He quoted patriots. He attacked short sellers with a venom usually reserved for personal enemies. Wall Street tolerated the eccentricity because the numbers were undeniable. LaCroix was defying the gravity of the grocery store. Usually, when a brand grows this fast, it burns cash to buy market share. LaCroix was gaining market share while saving cash. The brand had achieved velocity. In retail terms, velocity is how fast a product moves off the shelf. In 2017, LaCroix had the highest velocity in the water aisle. Retailers like Target and Whole Foods began tearing up their planograms to give LaCroix more space. They created entire LaCroix walls, massive, colorful displays that served as beacons for the millennial shopper. Competitors were paralyzed. PepsiCo launched Boobly. Coca-Cola bought Topo Chico, but they couldn't replicate the magic. Their brands felt corporate. LaCroix felt organic. By mid-2017, the company seemed invincible. They controlled the culture, they controlled the shelf, and they controlled the stock market. Analysts were predicting that National Beverage would be acquired by Pepsi or Coke for a massive premium. The rumor mill was churning, but bubbles by definition are fragile. The higher the stock price climbed, the more scrutiny it attracted. Short sellers began to dig into the company's operations. They looked at the natural essence claim. They looked at the eccentric CEO. And they wondered if the sparkling water empire was as pure as it claimed to be. The financial miracle was about to face a stress test, and the first crack in the dam wouldn't come from a competitor. It would come from a single angry customer with a lawyer. By late 2017, LaCroix had transcended the beverage aisle. It was no longer just a product. It was a cultural icon, as recognizable as the iPhone or the Starbucks mermaid. The brand had achieved what marketers call cultural ubiquity. You couldn't escape it. It appeared in music videos. In the video for I Spy by rapper Kyle, the artists are seen floating on giant inflatable LaCroix cans. It wasn't a paid placement, they just put it in because it was cool. It appeared on the runway. Fashion designers created unauthorized t-shirts, bathing suits, and enamel pins featuring the pamplemousse pattern. LaCroix didn't sue them for copyright infringement. They let it ride. Free advertising. It even appeared at weddings. LaCroix towers, massive pyramids of cans, became a trendy alternative to champagne fountains at hipster receptions. There were LaCroix-themed wedding cakes. The media couldn't stop writing about it. The New York Times, The New Yorker, and Vox all published think pieces trying to deconstruct the phenomenon. They called it meth for millennials. They called it the status symbol of the precarious generation. Nick Caparella, in his chaotic press releases, was jubilant. He declared that LaCroix was innocent. He framed the brand as a moral crusader against the sugar barons of Coke and Pepsi. The financials reflected this euphoria. Sales had crossed the $800 million mark. The brand was single-handedly driving the growth of the entire U.S. sparkling water category. It had crushed the competition. Perrier looked old. Dasani Sparkling looked corporate. LaCroix was the undisputed queen. But when you are on top of the world, there is only one way to go. The ubiquity had a downside. The brand was becoming too popular. The early adopters, the cool kids in Brooklyn and Silver Lake, started to move on. Once your mom starts drinking pamplemousse, it's no longer cool to drink pamplemousse. The hipster cycle was nearing its end. More dangerously, the spotlight brought scrutiny. For years, consumers had accepted the natural essence claim without question. They assumed natural meant squeezed fruit. They assumed innocent meant pure. But in a laboratory in Chicago, a law firm was running tests. They were analyzing the chemical vapors coming off a can of LaCroix, and they found compounds that didn't sound like fruit. They sounded like chemistry. Specifically, they found linalool. To a chemist, linalool is a naturally occurring terpene found in lavender and citrus peels. It is harmless. But to a lawyer looking for a payout, linalool has another definition. It is also an ingredient used in cockroach insecticide. The lawsuit was drafted. The press release was prepared. And the cockroach lawsuit was about to drop on the heads of the LaCroix faithful like a nuclear bomb. Did a single lawsuit about cockroaches almost destroy the brand? On October 1st, 2018, the LaCroix party came to a screeching, violent halt. For 3 years, the brand had enjoyed an uninterrupted honeymoon with the American public. It was the innocent drink. It was water, bubbles, and essence. It was pure. But on that Monday morning, a law firm named Beaumont Costales filed a class action lawsuit in Cook County, Illinois. The complaint was relatively standard legalese, accusing National Beverage Corp. Of false advertising regarding their 100% natural claim. However, the lawyers at Beaumont Costal knew how to write for the clickbait era. They didn't just list chemical compounds, they listed their applications. The lawsuit alleged that independent testing had revealed the presence of synthetic compounds in LaCroix, specifically linalool, limonene, and linalool propionate. Then came the kill shot. The complaint noted that linalool is used in cockroach insecticide. It was the perfect viral headline. It was designed to go nuclear. Within hours, every media outlet from CBS News to BuzzFeed was running with the story. LaCroix contains ingredient used in cockroach insecticide, lawsuit alleges. The impact was instantaneous. The internet, which had built the brand, turned on it with the ferocity of a lover scorned. The LaCroix, Bois, and the Instagram models were horrified. They looked at the pink can in their hand and didn't see pamplemousse anymore. They saw Raid. Social media exploded with memes, but this time they weren't affectionate. They were vicious. People posted videos pouring their LaCroix down the sink. They posted photos of dead cockroaches next to the cans. The health halo, the belief that LaCroix was a pure, virtuous alternative to soda, was shattered. The irony was tragic. The very thing that made LaCroix cool, its mystery, became its undoing. Because the company had never explained what natural essence actually was, the consumer's imagination filled in the blanks with the worst possible option: poison. National Beverage Corp. Issued a denial. They stated categorically, LaCroix contains no artificial ingredients. But in the court of public opinion, a denial is weak compared to a headline about bug spray. The damage was emotional, not rational. Consumers felt betrayed. They felt stupid. They had paid a premium for fancy water only to be told they were drinking chemicals. The stock price of National Beverage Corp. Fizz, which had been trading near all-time highs, fell off a cliff. In a single day, hundreds of millions of dollars in shareholder value evaporated. The insecticide lawsuit was the inciting incident of the crash. But the real tragedy wasn't the lawsuit itself, it was the fact that the company had no reservoir of goodwill to draw upon. They had relied on vibes for so long that when the vibes turned bad, they had no defense. And as the panic spread, scientists began to step forward to explain the truth about linalool. But they would soon discover that in 2018, fear travels much faster than chemistry. The lawsuit was technically accurate. LaCroix did contain linalool, and linalool is used in cockroach insecticide. But these two facts, while true, created a lie when placed next to each other without context. This was a weaponized deployment of chemophobia, the irrational fear of chemical names. In reality, linalool is one of the most common terpenes on planet Earth. It is the primary scent compound in lavender. It is found in mint, cinnamon, and birch trees. And crucially, it is found in the peels of citrus fruits. When you peel an orange and that zesty, oily mist sprays into the air, that is linalool. When you drink a cup of Earl Grey tea, you are drinking linalool. So why is it in cockroach poison? Because cockroaches hate strong smells. The insecticide industry uses linalool not because it is a deadly toxin to mammals, but because it overwhelms the sensory receptors of insects. It is actually considered a green, natural alternative to harsh chemical poisons. But in the court of public opinion, nuance is dead. The average consumer doesn't know what a terpene is. They just saw the word insecticide. The scandal revealed the fatal flaw in LaCroix's mystery marketing. For decades, the company had refused to define what natural essence meant. They treated their formula like the Coca-Cola secret recipe. They wanted to maintain an aura of magic, but in 2018, magic looks like hiding. When the scandal broke, National Beverage Corporation should have immediately released a video explaining the science. They should have had a chemist peel a grapefruit and explain that linalool is the essence of the fruit. They should have educated the consumer. Instead, they retreated into corporate denial. Their statements were vague legal defenses, asserting compliance with FDA regulations. They sounded like a politician caught in a scandal, not an honest brand having a conversation. This silence allowed the fear to metastasize. Consumers began to view the natural essence label with deep suspicion. If LaCroix was hiding linalool, what else were they hiding? Was the pamplemousse flavor actually made in a vat in New Jersey? The clean label movement, which had originally lifted LaCroix up, now turned against it. The definition of clean had shifted. It wasn't enough to be calorie-free. You had to be transparent. You had to list every single molecule. LaCroix had become a victim of its own simplicity. By listing only 2 ingredients, carbonated water, natural flavor, they left too much room for the consumer's imagination, and thanks to the lawsuit, the consumer was imagining dead bugs. As sales began to dip for the first time in a decade, the pressure mounted on the leadership. Investors were calling. Retailers were worried. The brand needed a leader to step up, take responsibility, and calm the storm. Instead, they got Nick Caporella, and he was about to pour gasoline on the fire. In a crisis, a company looks to its leader for stability. When Tylenol was poisoned in the 80s, the CEO stepped up, took responsibility, and saved the brand. When LaCroix was accused of containing insecticide, the world looked to Nick Caporella. What they got was not stability. It was poetry, and not the good kind. Nick Caporella had always been eccentric. He signed his earnings reports with patriotism and wrote in bold, colorful fonts. But as the stock price of National Beverage Corp began to freefall in early 2019, dropping nearly 50% from its highs, his behavior shifted from quirky billionaire to unhinged. Instead of hiring a crisis PR firm to issue a standard apology or a scientific rebuttal, Caporella decided to write the press releases himself. On March 7, 2019, National Beverage released a statement addressing the falling stock price and the sales decline. It is widely considered one of the most bizarre corporate documents in modern history. In the release, Caporella apologized, but not for the ingredients. He apologized for the injustice of the world. He compared the plight of managing LaCroix to the struggle of caring for a disabled person. He wrote, "We are truly sorry for these results. Negligence, nor mismanagement, nor woeful acts of God were not the drivers. Much of this was the result of injustice. Managing a brand is not so different from caring for someone who becomes handicapped. Brands do not see or hear, and they certainly do not speak. They are helpless in the face of attacks." The business world gasped. Wall Street analysts read the statement and wondered if the CEO was having a breakdown. The metaphor was offensive, confusing, and deeply unprofessional. It painted the company not as a fighter, but as a victim. It signaled to investors that there was no plan, only self-pity. Caporella then turned his rage toward the short sellers. He accused traders of manipulating the stock. He claimed the lawsuit was a conspiracy designed to destroy an American success story. This bunker mentality alienated everyone. The cool, detached irony of the LaCroix brand, the very thing that made it popular with millennials, was incompatible with the angry, rambling rantings of an 80-year-old man in Florida. The cool evaporated instantly. It is hard to feel trendy drinking a beverage when the CEO is shouting about injustice in a press release. Sales continued to plummet. In May 2019, National Beverage reported that sales had dropped significantly. The stock hit a multi-year low. The meltdown revealed the structural weakness of the company. National Beverage was not a modern corporation. It was a dictatorship. There was no board of directors strong enough to take the keyboard away from Caparella. There was no marketing VP powerful enough to say, "Nick, don't hit send." LaCroix was flying without a pilot. The brand that had conquered America by doing nothing was now losing America by doing too much. And while Caparella was writing his manifestos, the lawyers were quietly working in the background. They knew they couldn't win the insecticide lawsuit on the merits of public opinion. They needed a retreat. They needed the accusers to take it back. In the American justice system, you can sue anyone for anything, but eventually you have to show your work. After 2 years of headline stock crashes and PR disasters, the lawsuit that nearly destroyed LaCroix came to a sudden quiet end. In early 2020, the law firm that filed the suit, Beaumont Costales, issued a formal retraction. It was a stunning reversal. They admitted that the laboratory they used had never actually tested for synthetic ingredients properly. They admitted they had no evidence that the ingredients were artificial. The statement read, "The testing conducted by our firm was inconclusive and did not confirm that the ingredients were synthetic." The plaintiff withdrew the lawsuit. LaCroix was vindicated. Legally, they had won, but culturally, they had lost. The retraction got a fraction of the press coverage that the initial accusation received. The headline, "LaCroix contains insecticide," had traveled around the world. The headline, "Lawyers admit mistake," barely made the back page. The damage to the brand's health halo was permanent. The seed of doubt had been planted. Consumers now knew that natural essence was a legal term, not a literal one. They knew that the flavors came from a lab, even if that lab was using natural sources. The magic was gone. LaCroix had suffered from the broken window theory of branding. Once the first crack appeared, people started noticing other flaws. They noticed that the flavor wasn't actually that strong. They noticed that Nick Caparella was weird. They noticed that other brands were cheaper. By 2020, LaCroix had lost its monopoly on cool. It was no longer the exclusive accessory of the creative class. It was just a can of water. The Instagram cult moved on. Influencers stopped tagging the brand because it was no longer a status symbol. It was cringe. It was something your aunt drank. National Beverage Corporation survived. The stock price stabilized, though nowhere near its 2017 peak. But the era of hypergrowth was over. They were now fighting a trench war for market share. And the enemy was no longer Perrier or Coke. The enemy was a tsunami of copycats. Seeing LaCroix's weakness, the giants of the beverage world finally woke up. They realized they didn't need to invent a new brand. They just needed to copy the LaCroix playbook, but do it with more money and less drama. The bubble war was about to begin. Surviving the copycats and becoming a boring household staple. By 2019, the executives at Coca-Cola and PepsiCo had stopped laughing at the ugly neon can from Wisconsin. They were hemorrhaging market share. LaCroix had single-handedly proved that Americans would drink water if it was fun. For the giants, this was an embarrassment. They had spent billions on R&D, yet they had been beaten by a regional brand that spent zero on marketing. So they did what empires always do when they face a rebellion they cannot crush. They cloned it. PepsiCo moved first. In 2018, they launched Bubbly. If LaCroix was the indie band playing in a garage, Bubbly was the manufactured pop group put together by a record label. Every aspect of Bubbly was engineered to assassinate LaCroix. The cans were brightly colored. They used a friendly, lowercase font. They had cute little greetings on the tabs like hi or yo. And crucially, they had the entire Pepsi marketing machine behind them. While LaCroix relied on micro-influencers and vibes, Pepsi bought a Super Bowl ad. They hired crooner Michael Bublé to make jokes about the name. They plastered the subway stations of New York with ads. They used their massive distribution leverage to force bubbly onto the shelves right next to LaCroix, often at a lower price point. Then came Coca-Cola. After failing with the Dasani Sparkling, they launched AHA in 2020. AHA was designed to attack the flavor profile. They realized that LaCroix's single-note flavors were vulnerable, so AHA launched with duos, blueberry and pomegranate, lime and watermelon. They added a hit of caffeine to some SKUs to compete with coffee. The bubble war had officially begun. The shelves of Target and Kroger transformed into a rainbow battlefield. Suddenly, LaCroix wasn't the only colorful can. It was drowning in a sea of knockoffs. There was Waterloo, there was Spindrift, there was the store brand. This saturation had a devastating effect on LaCroix's cool factor. Scarcity creates desire. When LaCroix was the only neon can, it was a statement piece. When the entire aisle became a neon kaleidoscope, LaCroix just looked like one option among many. The visual distinctiveness of the billboarding effect was diluted. Financially, the impact was brutal. LaCroix's market share, which had hovered near 30% at its peak, began to erode. They weren't losing customers because the product was bad. They were losing them because the clones were cheaper and louder. National Beverage Corp found itself in a vice grip. They couldn't outspend Pepsi on ads. They couldn't outprice the store brands. The cockroach lawsuit had weakened their reputation, and now the clone army was taking their territory. Wall Street declared the brand dead. Analysts predicted that LaCroix would go the way of Snapple, a former icon swallowed up and forgotten. But just as the sharks were circling, something happened that no marketing executive could have predicted. A global event that would force everyone back into their homes, shut down the fancy coffee shops, and make the humble can of water essential again. In early 2020, LaCroix was on the ropes. The stock price had crashed. The lawsuit headlines were still fresh. Bubbly and AHA were eating into its shelf space. It looked like the end of the fad. Then came March 2020. The world shut down. The COVID-19 pandemic was a tragedy for humanity, but it was a lifeline for center-of-the-store brands, the packaged goods that live in the middle aisles of the supermarket. As lockdowns began, the cool economy collapsed. The fancy coffee shops closed. The juice bars closed. The open-plan startup offices, where LaCroix had been a free perk, went dark. Suddenly, millions of Americans were trapped in their homes. They were anxious, they were bored, and they were thirsty. The psychology of the grocery trip changed. It wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about comfort. People stopped looking for the next big thing and started looking for the old reliable thing. They wanted brands they recognized. LaCroix benefited from what economists call the lipstick effect. In times of economic recession or crisis, consumers cut back on big luxuries, but increased spending on small, affordable indulgences. A $5 pack of LaCroix became a way to treat yourself during a day of Zoom meetings. It was a small, fizzy reward for surviving another day of quarantine. Sales stabilized. The freefall stopped. The Pamplemousse can, which had become a symbol of 2017 hipster irony, became a symbol of 2020 survival. It was something bright and cheerful in a dark time. Crucially, the pandemic killed the cockroach narrative. When people were worried about a deadly airborne virus, they stopped caring about obscure lawsuits regarding Lena Lule. The hierarchy of fears had shifted. A little natural essence seemed harmless compared to a global pandemic. The consumption habit also changed. Before 2020, LaCroix was often a social drink, something you held at a party or put on your desk to signal your identity. During the lockdown, it became a private drink. People drank it alone in their kitchens. The performative aspect of the brand died, but the functional aspect, it tastes good and has no sugar, remained. This period allowed National Beverage Corp to catch its breath. They stopped trying to be the coolest brand on Instagram and accepted their new reality. They weren't the disruptor anymore. They were the incumbent. By 2021, as the world began to open up, LaCroix emerged from the bunker, damaged but alive. They had survived the lawsuit. They had survived the clones. They had survived the plague. But the market they returned to was different. The sparkling water category had matured. It wasn't a gold rush anymore. It was a utility. And to survive in this new world, LaCroix had to do something it had never done before. It had to admit that it wasn't special. It had to accept that it was just water. By 2022, the cycle of cool had completed its full rotation. The teenagers who had discovered LaCroix in 2016 were now adults with jobs and mortgages. To the new generation, Gen Z, LaCroix wasn't a discovery. It was something their parents drank. The cool crown had passed to a new wave of beverages. Liquid Death arrived, selling water in tallboy cans with skulls on them, marketing hydration as murdering your thirst. Olipop and Poppy emerged, selling functional soda with prebiotics for gut health, charging $3 a can. Compared to these aggressive, benefit-driven brands, LaCroix looked quaint. It looked simple. In the boardroom of National Beverage Corp, this realization triggered a strategic pivot. They stopped fighting to be the hot trend and started fighting to be the legacy staple. This is a critical transition for any consumer brand. It's the moment you stop trying to be Tesla and start being Toyota. You stop relying on hype and start relying on habit. LaCroix leaned into its new role as the default option. When you walk into a party in 2024, you expect to see LaCroix. It's not exciting anymore, but it's polite. It's the safe mixer. It's the beverage equivalent of a pair of blue jeans. Ubiquitous, classless, and essential. This shift protected them from the brutal inflation of 2023. As food prices skyrocketed, the functional sodas became expensive luxuries. Paying $12 for a 4-pack of prebiotic soda is a hard sell in a recession, but LaCroix managed to keep its price relatively grounded. Even with price hikes, a 12-pack was still under $6 in most markets. LaCroix became the value premium choice. It was fancier than the store brand, but cheaper than the new hipster brands. To keep the brand from feeling completely dusty, they launched the Nicola and Limoncello lines. Limoncello was a particular success. It was a sweeter, more vanilla-forward lemon flavor, packaged in a sleek, slightly more sophisticated can. It was designed to bridge the gap, appealing to the people who missed the sweetness of soda, but didn't want the sugar. It proved that the old dog could still learn a few new tricks. National Beverage Corp also quietly accepted that their stock price would never return to the dizzying heights of 2017. They settled into a new normal. Revenue stabilized around the $1.1 to $1.2 billion mark. They were profitable, debt-free, and steady. They had survived the journey from Midwest obscurity to global icon, to pariah, and finally to staple. Now LaCroix sits on the shelf like an elder statesman. The neon colors that once looked shocking now look comforting. And as we look at the legacy of this strange, bubbly empire, we are left with one final question. How did a can of water change the way the world looks? As we close the tab on the LaCroix story, we are left with a paradox. Here is a brand that did everything wrong. It had a weird name. It had an ugly can. It had an eccentric CEO. It spent $0 on marketing, and yet for a brief shining moment, it was the coolest product on earth. What is the legacy of the neon accident? First, LaCroix proved the power of design democracy. Before LaCroix, premium meant minimalist, serious, and boring. LaCroix proved that premium could be messy, colorful, and fun. It broke the rules of the grocery aisle. Walk into a supermarket today and you will see the LaCroix effect everywhere. On craft beer cans, on coffee bags, on kombucha bottles. The world is brighter because Nick Caparella decided he liked neon brushstrokes in 2002. Second, it taught us that authenticity cannot be bought. It must be discovered. LaCroix didn't become cool because they told us they were cool. They became cool because they let us tell them they were cool. They understood the psychology of the internet better than companies 10 times their size. They understood that in a world of paid influencers, the most valuable thing is an unpaid fan. But the story also serves as a warning about the fragility of trust. The insecticide lawsuit of 2018, however flimsy, revealed that you cannot build an empire on mystery forever. The modern consumer demands to know what is in the box. Natural essence is no longer a sufficient explanation. The fall of LaCroix from its peak teaches us that transparency is the only insurance policy against a PR disaster. Today, LaCroix is no longer a revolution. It is just water. The hipsters have moved on. The memes have faded. But millions of Americans still reach for that pamplemousse can every day. Not because it's trendy, but because it's there. It has become part of the furniture of American life. It started as a cheap alternative to Perrier for Midwest moms. It became a status symbol for coastal elites. And in the end, it's settled somewhere in the middle, a reliable, colorful, fizzy friend that promises nothing more than a moment of refreshment. And perhaps in a complicated world, a moment of refreshment is enough.